Okay, so now you're looking at the heart there, and you notice it has these large vessels attached to it. Four big ones. There's the aorta, the superior and the inferior vena cava, and then the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches pretty quickly and becomes the pulmonary arteries. And then you also have coming into the left atrium, you have the pulmonary veins. There's four pulmonary veins, two from the right lungs, two from the left lungs. So the aorta, superior and inferior vena cava, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary veins. Those are the big vessels that are directly attached to the heart. Now the valves of the heart, we covered those just in the previous video. For the pump to work, the pump has to have these check valves to prevent the backflow and such. And so you have the valves between the atria and the ventricles, the AVs, and then you have the semilunar valves that are from the ventricle to the great vessel. So from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk, or from the left ventricle to the aorta. These valves and such, they work, and the pump all works. It's the only way fluids move is via pressure. And so the ventricles contract, that starts to push, or really, we're only going to say the word compress, but liquids can't be compressed. It starts to increase the pressure of the chamber itself. And since the fluid can't compress, the fluid has to go somewhere. It can't go back to the atriums because the AV valves closed. And it prevents the AV valves have those strings, the chordae tendineae, which keep them from going back or prolapsing. That then the only way out is through the semilunar valves. So the ventricles, both right and left, contract, and this liquid blood must go through the semilunar valves. Now there is fluid in those trunks, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and the pressure in the ventricles has to be higher than the pressure in those trunks created by the fluid setting there. And so the pressure builds up. If it's high enough, it will eject that liquid out through those semilunar valves into those great vessels and such, and then either to the lung or to the rest of the body. When the ventricles contract, that pressure that's in those vessels pushes or wants to force that blood back. The semilunar valves open and you get a sound, and that prevents the blood from falling back or flowing backwards into the ventricles and such. A bacterial infection known as rheumatic fever, which is a complication of strep throat. Strep throat is caused by a streptococcal bacterial infection. Can damage connective tissue. It can affect your joints and other places of the body, but can also affect your heart valves. So don't let a bacterial infection ever go too long. Now the blood, or the heart is a muscle, and it must be fed. It needs blood going to it. So it has its own dedicated circulatory system, if you will. It's a coronary circulation and such. So branching off, the first branches off of that aorta are the right and left coronary arteries and such, and they will carry freshly oxygenated blood to the heart itself. The coronary artery will branch, and you'll get what's known as, on the left side, you'll get the left coronary artery, and it will branch, and one of those will go down the front through that anterior interventricular sulcus. That's known as the left anterior descending. And then the other branch will go around the side between the atria and the ventricle, and then kind of feed the back side of that left ventricle. The right coronary artery will pass in that coronary sulcus, that depression between the atria and the ventricles, and then it will branch, and you'll get a posterior interventricular artery going down the back side of the heart, and then a marginal branch which branches and kind of goes down the right side, if you will, and feeds the right ventricle. Those are sitting on the surface. After that, these vessels go into the heart itself, and that's beyond the scope of this class. As these vessels branch and go in, they feed all of the heart. It's all of the heart muscle and such. And there's more than one pathway. That is what an anastomosis is. And this is a way, kind of a protection, if you will, because if one little vessel or one pathway gets blocked, there's another pathway to feed that heart muscle and such. So you get all of that to the heart. Respiration takes place, cellular respiration takes place. The deoxygenated blood gets picked up through this venous system, and the venules to the veins, and they collect larger and larger. And then on the back side of the heart, they will collect into this large pouch called a coronary sinus, and then from there it goes into the right atrium. So looking at the muscle, at the microscopic level of the muscle and such, they are striated muscle fibers and such, but they're shorter and larger and such. They have just a single nucleus, and they are interconnected with one another. A lot of sarcoplasm. They have an abundant amount of cytoplasm, sarcoplasm and such. A lot of mitochondria, need that ATP and all. And then they have the same I band, A band, H zone, M line as we saw in skeletal muscle. One of the things that's different is that they have, a single nucleus, and then their sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR, is not as abundant as noticed in a regular skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscle, arranges itself into two major networks, the atrial network and the ventricular network and such. The two networks are not connected and such. There's actually connective tissue to prevent that and all. Individual muscle fibers touch other individual muscle fibers and such through what's known as an intercalated disc that can be observed in a slide prep of the heart muscle itself. These discs are not solid. They actually have little holes in them, and that allows the action potential that travels across the surface and then down and around to jump from muscle to muscle. In a skeletal muscle, if you remember, we had the transverse tubules that kind of carried the action potential deep into a skeletal muscle. Think of the gap junctions as similar, but going from muscle fiber to muscle fiber, allowing that action potential to travel rapidly across the surface of all of the muscles at the same time. Cardiac muscle cells beat independently. And you don't have to send an impulse to cause them to contract. They are autorhythmic. You, through your autonomic nervous system, will send messages to the heart to either speed up or to slow down. That's what you do. You don't tell it to beat. You don't tell it to not beat. You just say speed up in your contractions or slow down in your contractions. While the heart was developing in probably weeks 5, 6, 7, somewhere around in there, as the heart muscles were developing, a small portion of them became a type of interwoven nervous, if you will. It's not nervous tissue itself, but it's this 1%, and these are the ones that are actually the autorhythmic. And they set up, and this little part is found in the upper right atrium, and this is your natural pacemaker. And when these cells, this little small amount, depolarizes, it sends that signal across the surface of the atria, and they all depolarize at the same time. Then it travels down through these special fibers to this another similar structure that's on the lower midline of the right atrium, little area right there, and it collects it all and then sends it down through the septum to the apex and then back up to the ventricles and all. But it's an internal conducting system, kind of like your own nerves in the rest of your body, but it's contained within the heart. Part of this is, like I mentioned, that very first part in the upper right atrium is your SA node, your sinoatrial node. And then you have another node that is in that midline of the lower left area of the right atrium. That is the AV node. And then you have a collection of these fibers traveling down through the septum, through the interventricular septum. And that is your AV bundle. Later on, you'll see that known as the bundle of His, H-I-S. And then that branches, and then that goes, these fibers go back into the muscles of the ventricles, and those are known as Purkinje fibers. So the SA node is your natural pacemaker. You see where it's located right there. It is what causes, it is what starts the contractions and such. When it depolarizes, and why it depolarizes, only nature knows. It travels all the way across the atria, across the atrial septums and such, but it doesn't travel down to the ventricles. It all kind of then rolls back around or collects back around into that AV node. And then from the AV node, it travels down through the septum and such to the Purkinje fibers, where it branches and such and runs up. That bundle that travels down through the septum is known as the bundle of His right there. So the action potential generated by the SA node travels across all of the atrial muscles. They contract. It hits the AV node. It then travels to the bundle of His, to the Purkinjes, and comes back up. And then, boom, the ventricles contract. And the ventricles always contract from the apex toward the base. But Purkinje fibers are a portion of that conducting system that carries the action potential from the atria to the ventricular muscles. If left alone, your heart would beat about 90 to 100 times. That's beats per minute right there. If there is no neural input, if your brain wasn't talking to your heart, it would beat about 90 to 100 times per minute. Your heart, through an area of the medulla, sends a signal down through the vagus nerve that says, slow down. So then you have a resting heart rate. When your medulla is working correctly, when everything's working correctly, you get that. Something happens, you'll get a flush of epinephrine, adrenaline, from the adrenal gland, and that will cause your heart to speed up. Now, depending upon carbon dioxide levels, this, that, and the other, pH, you go through it all. What you see with your eyes, everything else, you can actually cause it to speed up. You can cause it to slow down and such. But its actual just base rhythm is set up by the medulla, or set up by the SA node. And then your resting heart rate is kind of adjusted via your medulla.